People often say that betrayal happens in an instant, a moment of weakness, a single mistake. But that's a lie. Betrayal is slow. It festers beneath the surface, hidden in stolen glances, in the flicker of hesitation before a smile, in the way a name lingers too long in a conversation. I should have seen it coming. But that night, at the gala, was the first time I felt it. The first crack in the perfect picture of my life. The evening was meant to be a grand affair, a gala filled with the city's elite, a night of elegance, networking, and polished smiles. I had attended events like this countless times before, but tonight, something was different. Not in the decor, not in the music or the champagne that flowed freely, but in the way Isabella carried herself. She had always been graceful, poised, an image of perfection. But beneath that perfection tonight, a nervous energy simmered, subtle yet persistent. The way she checked her phone too often, how her eyes flickered toward a specific part of the room more than once, and the brightness of her laughter, too quick, too eager, when she stood near Victor. The pieces didn't fit, but the picture was beginning to form. Trust had always been the foundation of our marriage. A bond strengthened over years of shared experiences, of whispered secrets in the quiet of the night. But trust, no matter how strong, can fracture in an instant. And tonight, I felt the first real break. I watched them. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help myself. The way her posture shifted when he spoke, how her fingers barely grazed his wrist, just a moment longer than necessary. The rational part of my mind told me I was overreacting, that I was searching for something that wasn't there. But my instincts, the ones honed from years in business, detecting deception behind polished words and perfect smiles, told me otherwise. She excused herself from the table, leaving her clutch beside me. A simple action, one she had done 100 times before. But when the screen lit up, casting a glow against the polished tablecloth, a name appeared that sent a chill through me. Victor. A message. A brief vibration. Another. I shouldn't have looked. I had never been the kind of man to pry, to question, to doubt. But instinct took over, suspicion pushing aside restraint. The words on the screen burned into my mind before the phone went dark again. Meet me outside in 10. A slow exhale left my lips, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The meaning wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't a business discussion. This wasn't innocent. The room swirled around me, conversations, laughter, the clinking of glasses, but I barely heard it. The gala had become nothing more than a backdrop to the realization settling like lead in my chest. I had a choice. Confrontation would be easy. I could demand answers, make a scene, turn this elegant event into a spectacle that would ripple through the city by morning. Or I could wait. Gather more than just suspicion, play the long game. Let them think they were in control. Patience had always served me well in business. It would serve me well now. She returned a few minutes later, her expression composed, unreadable. A slight touch to my shoulder, the curve of her lips forming the same practiced smile I had seen 1,000 times before. But now, it felt different. The years had taught me how to keep my face neutral, how to conceal thoughts behind a mask of pleasant indifference. And so I did what I had always done best. I played along. I laughed where I was supposed to, engaged in polite conversation, clinked glasses and toasts with those around me. But all the while I watched. I listened. And I waited. The game had only just begun. There is a moment in every unraveling where silence turns into certainty. The moment when doubt is no longer a whisper in the back of your mind, but a roaring confirmation that everything you feared was real. Mine came when I stepped onto the balcony, unnoticed, and saw Isabella standing too close to Victor. The gala carried on behind me, voices spilling from the ballroom, a mixture of laughter and conversation weaving through the air. But all I could focus on was them. The way she tilted her head slightly toward him, the way his hand hovered just at the small of her back, not touching, but close enough to feel. Close enough to show intent. I had played the game long enough to recognize when someone was being careful. They weren't reckless, not yet. They weren't kissing in the shadows or disappearing into a side room. No, they were still at the stage where they thought they were smarter than everyone else. That what they were doing wasn't obvious. That no one could see the truth forming between them like a slow-building storm. I took my time watching them. Studying. Cataloging every small detail. The way Isabella leaned in just a fraction too much when she laughed. The way Victor's fingers twitched as if he were resisting the urge to touch her. They thought they were in control, that their secret was theirs to keep. But secrets were fragile things. And tonight theirs would shatter. I stepped forward, slow, deliberate, making sure the sound of my shoes against the marble was just loud enough for them to hear. Isabella pulled back instantly, her body stiffening as she turned toward me, her eyes widening for the briefest second before she masked it with indifference. Victor, however, didn't have the same skill. His face betrayed him in an instant, his usual confidence cracking, even if only for a heartbeat. I let the silence stretch, heavy and thick, watching as Isabella forced herself to smile, forced herself to pretend. She was good at it. Years of practice in social circles had made her an expert at keeping up appearances. But I wasn't one of her admirers at a charity event, or a business associate waiting to be impressed. I was her husband. And I knew her better than anyone. The clinking of glasses and distant murmur of the gala continued, oblivious to the scene unfolding just beyond its walls. I could have confronted them then and there, could have let anger dictate my actions. But I wasn't a man who acted on impulse. I was a man who chose his moments. And this wasn't the one. Not yet. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, letting my gaze linger on Victor just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. Then, without a word, I turned on my heel and walked back inside. I felt their eyes on me, felt the tension hanging in the air like an unfinished note. But I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. The game had already changed. They just didn't know it yet. I re-entered the ballroom with a practiced ease, slipping back into the role of the composed, unaffected husband. I smiled, I shook hands, I engaged in conversation as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, a plan was already taking shape. I would not rage. I would not give them the satisfaction of knowing how deeply they had cut me. No, when the moment came, I would not simply expose them. I would make sure they never saw it coming. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, my grip steady, my smile effortless. Across the room, Isabella rejoined a circle of acquaintances, laughing at something I didn't care to hear. Victor, on the other hand, lingered near the bar, his posture tense, his shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. He felt it, the shift in the air, the unspoken change in dynamics. And that pleased me. I moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, noting how eyes followed me, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I listened to conversations I had no interest in, nodding at the right moments, masking the quiet rage simmering beneath my skin. A part of me wanted to test them, to see how far they were willing to go now that they knew I had seen them. Would they be cautious? Would they pull away? Or would they grow bolder, thinking they had the upper hand? Either way, I intended to let them believe whatever they wanted, until it was too late. The night stretched on, but my patience did not waver. This wasn't just about exposing them. This was about control. And if there was one thing I had mastered in life, it was knowing exactly when to strike. I wouldn't act yet. But the moment was coming. And when it did, either of them would be ready. I had expected them to be cautious after that night at the gala. I had assumed that my presence on the balcony, my silence in the ballroom, my unwavering composure would force them to retreat, to rethink their recklessness. But I had underestimated their arrogance. Days passed, and Isabella pretended as though nothing had happened. She moved through our home with the same practiced ease, greeting me in the mornings with a soft smile, engaging in polite conversations over dinner, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But I saw it now for what it was, a performance. She thought she had control. She thought she could deceive me. But I had learned long ago that control belonged to the one who knew more, the one who saw the pieces before they were played. And now I knew enough. I had waited long enough. That evening, I arrived home earlier than usual. Isabella was in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, flipping absently through a magazine. She looked up when she saw me, offering the same effortless smile she always did. I studied her for a moment, letting the silence settle between us. The way she shifted in her seat, the way her fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, it was all so subtle, but I caught it. A tell. A hesitation she had not yet learned to mask. I moved to the bar, poured myself a drink, and let the ice clink against the glass as I stirred it idly. I let her watch me. Let her wait. I had never been one to rush a moment like this. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the stillness. I knew who it was before I even glanced toward the window. Victor. Punctual, as always. The air in the room shifted. Isabella set her glass down, her movements controlled, deliberate. She exhaled softly, and for the first time, I saw something real in her expression: uncertainty. Not guilt. Not remorse. Just the realization that she was no longer ahead in the game. I turned toward the door before she could react, before she could find the words to deflect, to twist the situation into something she could manage. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway, and then, just as I expected, the doorbell rang. I opened it without hesitation. Victor stood there, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, as if this were just another casual evening, as if he hadn't been caught. He glanced past me, his confidence unwavering, his gaze flicking briefly to where Isabella stood behind me. I stepped aside. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence was enough. Victor hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping inside. He was a man used to walking into rooms with certainty, a man who rarely second-guessed himself. But tonight he did. I closed the door behind him, sealing the three of us inside. I took my time walking back to the living room, setting my drink down on the table beside Isabella's untouched wine. Neither of them spoke. I let the moment stretch, let the weight of it settle over us like a thick fog. Then, finally, I broke the silence. How long? My voice was calm, measured. Isabella inhaled sharply. Victor, to his credit, didn't flinch. But his smirk was gone now, replaced with something unreadable. Neither of them answered. I nodded, as if I had expected their silence. Then I turned to Victor, meeting his gaze without blinking. You know, in business, it's not about making the first move, it's about making the right one. His jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't speak. I let the words sink in before shifting my attention back to Isabella. And you were always good at reading the board. But you made one mistake. She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. You thought I wasn't paying attention. Silence. I exhaled slowly, then picked up my glass again, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. Sit down, both of you. We have things to discuss. Neither of them moved at first. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with unspoken words, with the weight of what had just begun. Then, slowly, Isabella sat, her back stiff, her hands folded in her lap. Victor followed suit, though his posture was different, guarded, as if bracing himself for the impact of something he couldn't predict. I leaned back into my chair, allowing myself a moment of satisfaction. I had spent days, weeks, playing this game, letting them believe they were in control. But now, they were exactly where I wanted them. Tell me, I said, my voice smooth, steady. Did you think this would last? Did you really believe I wouldn't notice? Or did you assume I wouldn't care? Isabella looked away. Victor held my gaze for a moment longer, but I could see it, the flicker of uncertainty, the realization that whatever advantage he thought he had was slipping through his fingers. I set my glass down, leaning forward slightly. You made a mistake. Both of you. And now we deal with it. My way. Neither of them spoke. They knew better now. This wasn't about anger or revenge. This was about control. And I had just taken it back. There was a strange sense of calm in knowing I had the upper hand. I had spent days, weeks, crafting my strategy, watching them, waiting for the moment when the scales would tip completely in my favor. Now, that moment had come. The night of the confrontation had been the first move in a much larger game. They had been caught, but catching them was never the end goal. It was merely the beginning. I had no intention of engaging in dramatic arguments or letting emotions cloud my judgment. That was their mistake, not mine. I spent the next morning with my lawyer. A well-calculated move. The folder I handed him was thick: documents, messages, photos. Proof. Undeniable, indisputable proof. Isabella might have thought she had been discreet, that Victor was careful. But secrets, especially those wrapped in arrogance, always left a trail. The plan was simple. The divorce would be swift, efficient. No long battles, no drawn-out negotiations. I had ensured that the legal prenuptial agreement left her with little leverage. She had gambled everything, and she would lose. Victor had more to lose than just my wife. He had his reputation, his position in the company, his standing among those who mattered. And I was prepared to take it all. A single meeting with the board was all it took. Numbers mattered more than relationships in business, and when presented with the risk that keeping Victor on board could bring, the decision was made. He was out. Isabella received the divorce papers 2 days later. I wasn't home when she got them. I didn't need to be. The message was clear. She called. I didn't answer. She sent messages. I didn't read them. Whatever explanations, justifications, or excuses she had meant nothing to me anymore. She tried once to come to the house. I watched through the window as she stood outside, hesitating before finally ringing the doorbell. I let it ring. Then again. And again. Eventually she left. The weight of her choices was finally settling on her shoulders. But it was no longer my concern. Victor made his own attempt at reaching out. A pathetic effort to salvage what little dignity he had left. I allowed myself one final indulgence. I met him for a drink. He walked in with forced confidence, but it was different now. The arrogance had been chipped away, replaced with something rawer. He sat across from me, trying to gauge where I stood, as if there was still a game to play. There wasn't. I let him speak, let him ramble through excuses, through empty justifications. When he finally stopped, waiting for my reaction, I simply smiled, finished my drink, and left without a word. Some betrayals don't deserve closure. Some just need to be buried. And as I walked out, leaving him sitting there alone, I knew I had already won. The divorce proceedings moved faster than she expected. Within weeks, everything was finalized. I knew Isabella had tried to fight it, tried to stall, to find some loophole that could buy her time, but there was none. The paperwork was airtight. She signed her name on the dotted line, and with it, the life she had built with me came to an end. The house was mine. The assets mine. The name she had once carried so proudly would no longer be hers. I watched as movers packed up her belongings, her presence slowly being erased from the home we had shared. She didn't ask to stay. She knew better. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't as composed. He had tried to rally support among business associates, hoping someone would back him, vouch for him. But the moment I severed ties, others followed suit. The market was ruthless. His credibility crumbled. Investors pulled out, projects were cancelled. Within months, he was nothing more than a footnote in an industry that had already moved on without him. One evening, I received an email from Isabella. A single line. Was it worth it? I stared at the words for a long time. Not because I doubted my answer, but because it was such a hollow attempt at making me second-guess myself. I never replied. Instead, I closed the laptop, poured myself a drink, and sat in the silence of my home. The home that was mine again. The life that was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The weeks that followed were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that should have been comforting, yet felt unfamiliar. I had won. I had taken everything from them, stripped them of their illusions, left them with nothing but the weight of their own betrayal. And yet, standing in my now empty house, I wondered why victory didn't feel more satisfying. The first few days had been filled with logistics. Finalizing the divorce, wrapping up business with the board, ensuring Victor's departure was permanent. I had buried myself in the details, keeping busy, keeping my mind occupied. But once the dust settled, I was left alone with a reality I hadn't fully prepared for. My life had revolved around two people who no longer had a place in it. The spaces they had once filled were now vacant, and while I had no desire to let them back in, I also didn't know what to do with the emptiness they left behind. I resumed my old routines, or at least I tried to. I woke up early, made coffee the way I always had, went to the gym, attended meetings. On the surface, I was the same man I had always been. But something had shifted. I caught myself lingering in doorways, staring at the places where Isabella's presence had once been. The quiet moments stretched longer than they should have. I told myself it was just a transition, just an adjustment period. But then the dreams started. At first, they were hazy recollections of the past, dinners, vacations, moments of laughter that felt so distant they may as well have belonged to another life. Then came the darker ones, her voice in the shadows, Victor's smirk in the boardroom, the cold, bitter taste of betrayal that clung to my subconscious even after I woke up. I would lie awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. I had wanted peace. I had wanted freedom. And I had both. But now, I had to figure out what to do with them. One evening, I found myself at a restaurant I hadn't been to in years. A place I used to love before life had become about obligations and appearances. The staff had changed, but the atmosphere was the same: dim lighting, soft music, the low murmur of conversation blending with the clinking of silverware. I sat at the bar, sipping a whiskey I hadn't tasted in a decade, and let myself exist in the moment. A woman sat a few stools down, reading a book. Not on her phone, not looking around for attention, just reading. I watched her for a moment, not with interest, not with intent, but with curiosity. She was lost in her world, completely at ease with herself. And I envied that. For the first time in weeks, I realized that I had spent so much time tearing things down that I hadn't thought about what came next. Revenge had been a purpose, but now that it was complete, I was left without one. I finished my drink, left a generous tip, and stepped outside. The city hummed around me, alive and indifferent. And for the first time since it all began, I let out a breath that didn't feel heavy. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time, I was ready to find out.